imagine trying to defend yourself in court. Like, your literal freedom is on the line.
Right. A terrifying scenario for anyone.
Yeah, totally. But instead of bringing in character witnesses or, citing past legal rulings to protect yourself.
Or hiring a really expensive lawyer.
Exactly. Instead of doing any of that, you step up to the bench and you just start laying out the laws of statistical physics.
Just pulling out a whiteboard in the courtroom.
I mean, literally. You bring up quantum mechanics, you start mapping out network topography. You are fighting this massive legal battle, but the weapons you've chosen are, well, hard mathematics and the fundamental laws of the universe.
It sounds like a premise ripped straight out of a science fiction novel, honestly.
It really does.
Because you expect the law to be this, this neat, structured, binary system, broken or not broken, guilty or not guilty, just straightforward cause and effect.
Right.
But when someone introduces these immutable physical laws that govern complex systems into a rigid courtroom setting, that clean binary doesn't just bend,
Yeah.
It completely shatters.
And that profound collision is exactly what we're diving into today. Because we have a massive, just truly fascinating stack of sources for you.
So much data to get through.
Yeah, we're looking at a collection of AI-generated analyses. These are deep, rigorous, multi-layered breakdowns from models like Gemini, Grok, and ChatGPT. And they are all analyzing the incredibly unique case of Dr. Chen Jingwan.
Specifically his bloodletter defense, right?
Yes, exactly. This highly technical document he wrote entirely from memory, which is wild.
From memory.
Yeah, from memory while sitting in a prison cell.
Which is it's an incredible feat of intellect. And the mission for this deep dive is to really understand the mechanics of this clash. We're going to explore what happens when modern complex system science and cultural psychology collide head-on with a traditional, highly rigid legal framework.
A framework that operates on completely different underlying assumptions about how the real world actually works.
Precisely.
Now, before we jump into the physics and the psychology of this case, we do need to make something explicitly clear to you as a listener. The sources we are looking at today deal with highly politically charged legal and social themes.
Coming out of contemporary China.
Right. So we want to state right up front, we are not taking sides here.
No, absolutely not.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints, political or otherwise, contained in the original content. Our only goal today, really, is to strictly and impartially report on the fascinating intellectual, psychological, and scientific arguments that Dr. Chen laid out.
And to unpack how these AI models analyze those exact arguments. Because we're examining this as a specimen of a civilizational fault line.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, it's a pure exploration of epistemology, which is really just a fancy academic's way of saying we're looking at how human beings know what they know and how fundamentally different systems go about defining truth.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we get to the heavy math of Dr. Chen's defense, the Gemini analysis strongly suggested we first need to understand the psychological battlefield he was walking into.
You have to set the stage.
Right. Like, why were the defendant and the judicial system speaking completely different languages from the very beginning?
Well, to understand that disconnect, the AI sources point us to the work of cultural psychologist Michelle Gelfand.
Oh, I've heard of her work.
Yeah, she's brilliant. She developed this foundational theory classifying societies into tight versus loose cultures.
Right, right.
And the Grok analysis specifically frames the judicial system, in this case, as an extreme manifestation of a tight culture.
So what does that actually mean in practice? Like, how does a tight culture operate?
Well, in a tight culture, the social order is viewed as incredibly fragile, almost like a house of cards. And because of that perceived fragility, the system requires strict norms, absolute compliance, and a strong preference for what we call preventative suppression.
Preventative suppression.
Exactly. The primary goal of the legal apparatus isn't necessarily establishing a granular, objective, factual truth about an isolated incident. Instead, the goal is maintaining the structural integrity of the whole society.
Oh, wow. Okay, that makes so much sense when you look at Dr. Chen's background.
Right.
Because he's a scientist.
Right.
He represents the classic loose culture of the academic community. And in that world, truth is the absolute highest priority. And how do you find truth in science? through doubt, through falsification, by constantly testing the boundaries of what you think you know.
Yes. And what's so fascinating here is that the very behaviors, a loose culture, rewards like questioning the premise, picking apart the logic, testing the variables, are perceived by a tight culture as a direct existential threat.
It's not seen as a robust defense at all.
Not even a little bit. It's seen as an attack on the rules themselves.
That actually makes me think of an analogy.
Well, let's hear it.
It's like, okay, imagine you have a brilliant improvisational jazz musician.
Okay, I'm with you.
And suddenly, this jazz musician is being evaluated by a strict marching band conductor. Now, the jazz musician thrives on playing around the beat, finding new harmonies, testing the boundaries of the chord progression. That is their truth, That's how they make art.
Right, but to the marching band conductor.
Exactly, to the marching band conductor whose entire worldview relies on absolute rigid formation and everyone stepping on the exact same beat at the exact same time. That improvisation isn't art. It's a provocation. It's a literal threat to the entire formation.
That paints a really vivid picture of the dynamic. I love that. And the psychological divergence actually goes even deeper than that.
Wait, really? Deeper how?
Well, Richard Nisbet's research on holistic versus analytic thinking comes up in the ChatGPT breakdown, and it explains the actual mechanics of how the court reached its conclusion.
Okay, so break that down for me.
The judicial system utilized a form of what's called naive holistic thinking. So they weren't looking at the isolated mechanics of Dr. Chen's specific action. Instead, they judged his overall vibe.
His vibe in a court of law.
Basically, yeah. They looked at the broader context. Their logic was essentially, here is a highly educated person. He is posting or forwarding negative information online. Therefore, his overall stance or attitude is wrong. And if his stance is wrong, he inherently must be causing disorder.
I hear that, but as a listener, I'm thinking, isn't the law supposed to be, objective? If someone just uses math in a courtroom to explain their actions, how does psychology explain the court viewing a literal equation as an actual provocation?
That's a great question. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at Geert Hofstede's concept of power distance.
Power distance?
Yeah, it measures how much a culture accepts inequality in power. In a high-power distance culture, the authority figures hold an absolute monopoly on truth.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Right. So when Dr. Chen starts citing complex mathematics, network theory, and physics to prove he couldn't possibly have caused harm, the court doesn't interpret that as evidence.
They interpret it as him showing off.
Worse, they interpret it as a display of intellectual superiority. They perceive it as a power overstep. By using logic they don't control or understand, he is directly challenging their exclusive right to define reality.
Man, I was reading through the source documents, and there's this incredible detail about him quoting Gödel's incompleteness theorem.
Oh, that part is wild.
It really is. Now, I vaguely remembered Gödel from a college philosophy class, but I definitely had to refresh my memory. Basically, Kurt Gödel proved mathematically that in any complex formal system, there are true statements that you literally cannot prove using the rules of that system.
Meaning that math itself is incomplete.
Exactly. And Chen used this theorem to demonstrate what he called cognitive humility.
Which is a beautiful concept.
It is. He was basically saying to the judge, look, even the purest language of math has limits and blind spots. Therefore, human reason has limits, and we can't know everything with absolute certainty, including your legal interpretations.
And how do you think the court interpreted that plea for humility?
Well, the Gemini source quotes the court's reaction. They literally interpreted it as malicious intent.
Of course they did.
Yeah. They essentially concluded, you are highly educated, you know the rules are imperfect, yet you are intentionally exploiting those imperfections to break them anyway.
It is a profound, almost tragic misinterpretation of meaning. I mean, the system demanded straightforward compliance, and he offered them an epistemological critique.
Right.
It highlights a complete failure of cross-cultural dialogue happening entirely within the walls of a single courtroom.
And because the court viewed his mathematical defense as an attack on their authority, they still had to legally define how his actions caused harm.
Which brings us to the actual physical charges against him.
Right. The core accusation was that by forwarding a specific post online, he caused a severe disorder of public order.
And this is where his defense shifts from philosophical psychology to the hard structural physics of networks. He knew he had to dismantle the legal concept of cause and effect using science.
The ChatGPT source highlighted that Dr. Chen leaned heavily on the concept of scale-free networks. which is a theory popularized by the physicist Albert Laszlo Barabasi.
A hugely important concept in modern network theory.
Yeah, and when I was reading this, I tried to visualize my own social media feeds like Twitter or Instagram. These platforms are not an even playing field where everyone's voice carries the same weight.
Not at all.
They are scale-free networks, meaning they follow a power law distribution. You have massive hub nodes. These are your celebrities, your state media outlets, the algorithmic trending pages, accounts with tens of millions of followers.
The heavy hitters.
Exactly. And then you have the peripheral nodes. That's most of us. The average everyday user is just hanging out at the very fringes of the network.
The distinction in structural power between those two types of nodes is literally everything in this case.
Well, the evidence submitted in the blood letter showed that Dr. Chen had fewer than 100 followers.
Wow. Fewer than 100.
Yeah. And most of those were completely inactive, essentially just zombie accounts. His interaction rate was practically zero. He was the absolute definition of a peripheral node in the deep, quiet, long tail of the network.
So he's practically a ghost online.
Right. So how does being a peripheral node actually protect him legally?
To explain that, the Grok analysis brings in Reuven Cohen's critical threshold formula and the broader concept of network robustness.
Network robustness. Okay, what does that mean?
Well, what Cohen and his colleagues proved mathematically is that scale-free networks have a very specific, almost paradoxical vulnerability profile. On one hand, they are incredibly fragile against targeted attacks.
Like if you take out the hubs.
Exactly. If you take down just a few of the major hubs, the entire network splinters and completely collapses. But on the other hand, they possess extreme, almost indestructible robustness against random failures or activities at the edges.
Meaning you could wipe out millions of peripheral nodes and the network wouldn't even blink.
That's exactly it. Removing, or in Chen's case adding, the activity of a single peripheral node has a mathematical impact on the macro structure of the network that asymptotically approaches absolute zero.
Basically nothing.
Literally nothing. You could take his account entirely out of the equation or have him forward a post every single minute of the day, and the statistical effect on the network's overall connectivity, flow, or order is completely negligible.
It's just a drop in the bucket.
It's a structural impossibility for him to shift the network.
I mean, I'm looking at these stats and I get that he's a tiny node. But the sources got me thinking, doesn't this entirely ignore the butterfly effect?
Chaos theory.
Right. We've all heard the chaos theory trope, right?
Duh.
A tiny butterfly flaps its wings in a forest in Brazil, and weeks later it sets off a massive tornado in Texas. Couldn't a tiny node, under the exact right circumstances, be the butterfly that flaps its wings and causes a massive hurricane of social disorder?
This raises an incredibly important question. And honestly, it is the exact counter-argument Dr. Chen anticipated the prosecution might use. To address the butterfly effect logically, we have to look at the hard mathematics of an avalanche.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
It really does. To dismantle the butterfly effect, the AI analyses show that Chen utilized the Galton-Watson branching process and the theory of self-organized criticality.
Self-organized criticality.
Often abbreviated as SOC.
Okay, let's slow down here. Break those down for me, because these were definitely the densest parts of the source material.
Sure. Let's start with self-organized criticality. The classic way physicists explain SOC is by visualizing a sand pile.
Like a literal pile of sand on a desk.
Yeah. Imagine you are dropping sand onto a flat table, just one single grain at a time. Slowly, it builds up into a cone. Eventually, the sides of the cone get incredibly steep. The system reaches what's called a critical state.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
At that exact point, dropping just one more single grain of sand can cause a massive avalanche that wipes out half the pile. Now, if you ask a traditional lawyer what caused the avalanche, they will point to that final grain of sand.
Because it's the immediate trigger. It's linear cause and effect.
Exactly. But a physicist using SOC says, no, the grain of sand didn't cause the avalanche. The geometry of the pile caused the avalanche.
Oh, wow.
Right. The system had self-organized into a state of instability where an avalanche was inevitable anyway. Literally any grain could have done it.
That makes so much sense. So how does the Galton-Watson branching process fit into his defense?
Well, the branching process is how we measure whether information can actually create an avalanche in a network in the first place. Originally, it was a 19th century statistical tool used to calculate the probability of aristocratic family names dying out.
That's a very specific use case.
Very Victorian, yeah. But today we use it to measure information propagation or viral outbreaks. You measure the average branching number. I've seen this a lot recently in epidemiology. It's often called R0, or the basic reproduction number.
Right, like if one person shares a post and two people share it from them, the R0 or branching number is 2.
Exactly. For an avalanche to happen, for a piece of information to go truly viral and cause a severe disorder, that branching number must be strictly greater than 1. The system has to be in what physicists call a supercritical state.
And if it's less than 1,
Then the cascade will eventually hit a dead end and just die out.
and the specific metrics from the sources on Dr. Chen are just mind-blowing here. Based on his actual follower count, the zombie accounts, and his historical interaction rate, the AI models estimated his personal branching number was hovering between 0.5 and 0.12.
That is incredibly low. That puts him in what complex systems theorists call the deep subcritical zone.
Right. And in a deep subcritical zone where the number is vastly smaller than 1, the extinction probability of that information cascade is essentially 100%.
It's guaranteed to stop.
The math literally dictates that the expected total spread size of his post is around 1.11, meaning he posts it, statistically maybe 1/10 of a person reacts to it, and then it dies instantly.
A macro avalanche initiated by his single post wasn't just highly unlikely. It was mathematically and physically impossible.
Impossible.
What's fascinating here is how this recontextualizes the butterfly effect for the courtroom. The butterfly effect only works if the system itself is already in a critical or supercritical state.
Right, if the sand pile's already too steep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If an avalanche did happen in public order, the root cause isn't the snowflake, which is Dr. Chen, but the unstable mountain.
The mountain is already primed to collapse.
And ironically, according to network science, who controls the stability of the mountain?
The hubs.
Yes. The hub nodes, the massive accounts, the platform algorithms, and the institutional authorities themselves. They are the ones with the actual concentrated structural power to trigger a systemic avalanche or to erode public trust to the point where the sand pile reaches a critical state.
So they're blaming him for their own structural instability.
The burden of the avalanche fundamentally belongs to the mountain, not the snowflake.
Man, so Chen used scale-free networks and branching math to prove he couldn't physically cause the disorder, but he didn't stop there, did he?
No, he went even further.
Yeah, he went a step further in the blood letter. He essentially argued that the perfectly unified order the court was trying to protect doesn't actually exist in the first place.
Which is a brilliant philosophical and technical pivot. How did he build that argument?
Well, I actually had to look this up when the ChatGPT source brought it up. He uses the CAP theorem.
The CAP theorem.
Yeah, Eric Brewer created it in the late 90s, and it stands for consistency, availability, and partition tolerance. It's a foundational, unbreakable rule for distributed computer systems.
It's kind of the golden rule of database engineering.
Right. It states that a distributed data system can only ever guarantee 2 of those 3 traits at the same time. Because network partitions, meaning nodes losing connection, physical cable cuts, geographic distance, delays, those are completely inevitable in the real world.
You can't avoid them.
Exactly. So distributed systems must have partition tolerance, which means as an engineer, you are forced to choose between strict consistency, where everyone sees the exact same data at the exact same time, and availability, where the system always responds.
And social networks have to choose, right?
Global social networks, by design, choose availability. They want you to always be able to load the app and see something. They willingly sacrifice strict consistency to get it.
Right, but that is the computer science definition. How does Chen apply a database rule to a legal definition of human social order?
That was exactly my pushback when I read the source. Like, applying a database theorem to human society feels like a massive stretch. How did he justify making that leap?
It's actually a profound epistemological translation. Chen used the CAP theorem to prove that a decentralized, distributed network of human beings cannot reach global consensus or absolute order by its very design.
Because we're all partitioned.
Exactly. It is physically impossible for every single node on a global social network, millions of people with different connections and lag times, to possess the exact same consistent state of information at the exact same time.
Because if it tried to force absolute consistency, the network would just freeze every time one person lost connection. It would lose availability.
You got it. Therefore, what the traditional court calls disorder, the inconsistency, the noise, the divergence of opinions, the contradictory information floating around, that is actually an intrinsic physical background state of the system.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. It is not an anomaly caused by a single malicious user. It is the hum of the engine.
The hum of the engine. Oh, I love that. So punishing an individual user for causing background noise is a massive category error. It's like punishing a single drop of rain for making the ocean wet.
That's a perfect analogy.
The ocean is already wet by definition. The network is already physically inconsistent.
It highlights the deep tragedy of the situation, honestly. The judicial system is looking at the natural mathematical reality of a complex system, identifying that natural state as a crime, and then forcefully assigning blame to a statistical non-entity within that system just to maintain the illusion of control.
So what does this all mean for you? As we look at the AI analyses of Dr. Chen's blood-letter defense, we are witnessing the fundamental brilliance of this case. It is a perfect specimen of a civilizational fault line.
A true clash of worlds.
Yeah. On one side, you have a modern scientific mind applying quantum-level network dynamics, scale-free topologies, and distributed systems theory. And on the other side, you have a pre-modern legal framework that is relying entirely on 17th century linear mechanical cause and effect, like you pressed a button on a keyboard, therefore you directly caused a riot.
Which raises an incredibly important question about the burden of proof. The legal system demanded that Dr. Chen prove a negative, that he didn't cause an effect.
Which is incredibly hard to do.
They forced a man sitting in a cell to use advanced theoretical physics just to defend himself against a pseudo-proposition. I mean, the court offered no empirical data, no cascade metrics, no proof of a supercritical R0 state.
None of it.
They simply asserted that his action caused disorder. Dr. Chen had to invoke the immutable laws of the universe just to prove that their assertion was mathematically impossible.
He had to do the rigorous math that the system completely refused to do.
And the lingering thought here, the piece that I find most striking when synthesizing all these AI sources, is this power can dictate legal definitions. A court can write whatever it wants on a piece of paper, stamp it, and enforce it with a gavel.
Right.
But human power cannot alter mathematical constants or physical laws. A branching number of 0.05 will always guarantee the extinction of a cascade, regardless of the jurisdiction or the political climate.
Which leaves us with a truly wild thought to chew on. As our physical lives and our complex digital networks become completely indistinguishable from one another, we are forced to ask, what happens to a society if its legal code fundamentally refuses to acknowledge the mathematical realities governing those networks?
It's a scary thought.
It is. But the sources also point to an even more provocative future. If mathematics and physics are the only true objective ways to measure impact in a complex society, will we eventually replace human judges entirely?
Now there's the thought.
Could future legal systems simply be open-source algorithms where guilt and innocence are calculated by AI measuring network topography, removing human bias and cultural tightness from the equation completely?
It really forces us to wonder if a civilization can even survive the digital age, if its justice system remains scientifically obsolete.
That's the question you're left with. When you step into that courtroom and you realize the system isn't just ignoring your defense, but they literally lack the vocabulary to comprehend the physics of the reality you are describing.
They're measuring a completely different universe.
Exactly. They aren't just reading the facts wrong. They are measuring a completely different universe.
Yeah.